And our next session, let me get my notes together here, is Dr. Michael Sayer. This is a keynote oration sponsored by Laerdal. As I mentioned, the one before morning tea was by Stryker, so we thank Stryker for that and Laerdal for this one. And our speaker comes from Seattle, which is a beautiful city. I've been there often. And Mark, you mentioned about bringing London weather here to Adelaide. Well, Mark could actually claim he brought Seattle weather to Adelaide. It's a lovely city, but it does rain rather well. It does have one of the world's great bookshops, however, Eliot's Bookshop, which I strongly recommend if you ever go to Seattle. Well, I think we're about all gathered now, so I hope you've enjoyed the morning tea. Might help next time if we got back a little quicker, but we'll try and organise that. Our next speaker, I quoted our next speaker earlier this morning when, in my comments first thing this morning, when I said in his work in establishing the Resuscitation Foundation back in 2008, resuscitation is ultimately life-affirming. It is an ennobling act that reveals much about our society's value, namely that human life has a value. And I was struck by the fact that it seems Michael's interest in emergency resuscitation goes back right to his residency days. He commented that he wondered how he would know if our service, because he was on residency for a month with the EMS, he wondered how he would know if our service provided excellent care and learned about measuring cardiac arrest survival rates. And that led to his significant involvement in international guidelines development. And in the process of that, he's quoted on some other occasion as saying, some communities think that if they had a new drug or a better CPR method, they'd have better survival rates. When he said that perhaps missed the point, that the real issue is more effort in quality management, more training, and more awareness of bystanders. So Michael Sayer from the Resuscitation Academy in Seattle, Washington, he'll talk about the first-year successes of the Global Resuscitation Alliance. His remarkable career has spanned many roles in the US, including his appointment as chair of the Emergency Cardiovascular Care Committee for the American Heart Association during 2010, the guideline cycle. In 2012, he moved to the University of Washington, where he's an emergency physician at Harborview Medical Center, and he also serves as the medical director of the Seattle Fire Department Medic One program and directs the University of Washington EMS Medicine Fellowship. So there's a great deal there. But we're really looking forward to hearing you this morning, Michael. Please welcome Michael Sayer.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Whoa. Stay away from that. It's a little loud there, Frank. That's good. Can you hear me in the back okay? Yeah. Everybody out there? You guys good? All right. Who's heard of the Global Resuscitation Alliance before they came to this meeting? Most of you, I hope, because you're in the Global Resuscitation Alliance masterclass. And what I thought I would do this morning is spend just a little bit of time going over some of the things that have been accomplished since this project was launched formally in May of 2016. So it's been a little more than a year, and so I think we can celebrate some successes. So I'd like to start with a story. The young man you see here in this picture had a cardiac arrest on his way to work in September of 2016 in Seattle, where I live. And he's 36 years old, was sitting in the front seat of the truck with his mate who's driving him to work, where he's one of these guys that climbs up on one of the big billboards, and they put up the giant sheets of paper and glue them up there, however that goes. So that's what he does for a living. And it's 7:30 in the morning, and he's on a busy Seattle road, and he suddenly starts to make funny sounds, and his friend cannot wake him up. So he calls 911, or as you would say, 000 here in Australia, and explains what's going on, and the call taker says, wow, your friend needs CPR, you need to get him out of the truck and on the side of the road. And when he did that, at the same time, the system responded. And that included a variety of things. In our system, we send a lot of resources to a cardiac arrest, so it includes 2 fire engines, a paramedic ambulance. And in this case, it alerted our PulsePoint app. And one of my partners, an emergency physician named Matt Gittinger, who you see in this check shirt here, was having some coffee at his breakfast table and heard about this a couple blocks away. So he pulled on his shoes and ran down the hill and got there to see a bit of what he described later as CPR, but not real effective CPR going on. And he was able to take over and I think provide better quality CPR until the fire engine got there and defibrillated the patient. And it's really those kinds of events is why we're here, right? It's about getting a 36-year-old back to his family so he can hold his baby. And that's why we're doing this job. Now, many of us have participated in and promoted guidelines to enhance the care of victims of cardiac arrest. And the guidelines are important. It helps people decide how to deliver the care that they need to give at 2 o'clock in the morning when they really can't go look it up. So that's an important step, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't actually get you what you need in terms of high-quality care. And what we've seen is we've been publishing guidelines since the late 1960s around how do you care for cardiac arrest, and the survival rates remain dismally low. For ventricular fibrillation and all the published literature, it's around 1 out of 8 patients survive. And we know that there's a big disparity, and some places do better than others. But in the U.S., this is the report for all of 2016 from the national group that tries to get people to report cardiac arrest survival within the United States. And you see 61,000 plus cases of cardiac arrest reported and an overall survival rate to hospital discharge of 10.8%, which is essentially the same as it's been for the past few years. So it's a little disappointing that we're not seeing much improvement there. But this big disparity that exists in survival among different communities gives us hope, actually, because it tells us that the places that are doing well can serve as benchmarks for the systems that are doing less well, because there's typically not a lot of other differences other than how well they actually implement the guidelines that were promoted. And it's this implementation piece that's been missing, and that's really what the Global Resuscitation Alliance is working on. And we believe it's important that we set goals to really drive care. And this group met first in 2015, then in 2016, and now again in 2017. And the goal is to increase survival by 50%. So take that 10% overall survival rate number and move it to 20, which would be pretty phenomenal, or move it to 15. 20 would be even better. 15, I can't do math this early in the morning, sorry. 15. And how? Just by more effective implementation of what we know works. So, one of my colleagues that I work with in Seattle, Mickey Eisenberg, he has 10 fingers, and so we have 10 steps, okay? It's really not any more complicated than that. He's very adamant about there have to be 10. We said, Mickey, there's really only 7 or 8 things. Nope, it's got to be 10. All right, well, then it'll be 10. So some of these are already happening in Australia. You have a pretty decent cardiac arrest registry that's up and running in much of the country already. Places are doing telecommunicator CPR at some level. My guess is there's opportunities for improvement there. A few places have begun to implement improved CPR strategies and better teamwork, faster dispatch, public access defibrillator programs, smart technologies. I think there's a presentation coming on that soon. And accountability, publishing annual reports. I know some of the states have that going as well, where the community can see how the survival rate is changing over time. And all these things together work along with the leadership to create a culture of excellence so that the whole organization strives to really provide the best possible care just like it did for the young man early that I presented. So one of the ways that I've had to learn how to deal with this is essentially go to change management school and learn how to drive change. How is it that we actually get these organizations to move? Because they've been doing things a certain way for a long time. Even if they're not necessarily producing good outcomes, they're comfortable because that's what they know. And getting them to change that can be a challenge. So one of them is to celebrate these wins. So one of our recent medical school graduates, a guy named Keir Warner, has now been out of medical school for 14 months and is working on his residency in emergency medicine at Stanford, which is south of Seattle. And he helped to promote a CPR training course, a high-performance CPR team training for the Palo Alto Fire Department, which serves the area around Stanford. And about 2 months later, they had success. They had a patient survive. And it's not that big a community, so they don't do that much CPR. And they kind of had adopted a strategy, or their cultural expectation was that pretty much no one survived, instead of it being that everybody survives. And they had a win. They had somebody that survived. And that really got them energized. And Keir was excited about it and texted us to tell us about this. So he is making sure that that's getting celebrated within Palo Alto. And that's going, I'm confident, to be contagious. And other teams will hear about that, and they'll want to get something similar to happen to their patients. So the guiding philosophy for the Global Resuscitation Alliance are these things, that we're producing products that help do that teaching, and they're available, maybe free or at very low cost, to organizations that want to use them. Certainly you can do your own, doesn't matter to us, as long as you work toward the goal of increasing survival by 50%. We're trying to share these materials and provide mentorship to learn from each other. We don't have all the answers, and we know many of you have better answers to some of these problems, and we can learn from you. So let me just show you a couple of things that have gone on over this last year. In 2016, there were more than 27 events that were part of the Global Resuscitation Alliance mission held around the world, including in Australia. One of the interesting ones that started is the Heart Runner trial in Copenhagen. And this is a crowdsourced app where they go and they grab an AED and take it to one of the victims of cardiac arrest. And it began at the meeting that we had in Copenhagen last May. So this is going to be a randomized trial of this strategy, so we'll be able to ultimately know how big an effect this kind of strategy actually has, with response times in the capital region of Copenhagen, which are pretty similar to many of the Australian states' urban type response times. So it should translate pretty well to what you're doing, depending on what the results are. Paul Gowans, who's one of the lead consultant paramedics for Scotland, has really been energetic. They've had a pot of money of about £5 million, I believe, to promote a better system of care for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in Scotland. And they've done quite a bit of training of various different groups. They're piloting using intensive care paramedics to see if they can use them to help improve the survival rate. And it's a very ambitious plan. Some of you may be aware, and I don't know if Mark shared some of this earlier, about a couple of clinical trials that are going on within the United Kingdom, which I think will drive future guidelines changes, potentially. So one is the Paramedic 2 trial, which is testing adrenaline, or it's getting a name change, epinephrine, versus placebo. And we'll see what kind of impact that has. They've almost finished recruitment in that trial. Another is the Airways 2 study, which is comparing an eye gel versus an endotracheal tube during cardiac arrest, which is also nearing its goal of 9,000 patients enrolled. So these are good studies, not just because they answer science questions, but because they engage many of the communities in focusing on how they care for cardiac arrest. And I'm confident that doing so raises the bar and they get more survivors just because they're paying attention to the details. Some of you are aware that the Good Sam app and other apps like this are available and are useful, I think, in terms of mobilizing people to get rescuers to come. So these are now being promoted throughout many communities in the United Kingdom. Similar apps available in the U.S., as I showed you earlier, as well as in Northern Europe. So one out of Stockholm that's being used in Copenhagen. And I know that Ambulance Victoria is planning to roll out an app, and I know that the St. John Ambulance in Western Australia has their own app. And I think all these apps basically are good, and we're all going to learn a lot from them. And it's likely this is going to help improve survival further. Closer to here, we have the PAROS group, which is the sort of cardiac arrest registry for much of Asia. And they're really focusing on telephone or dispatcher-assisted CPR as a way to try to raise survival rates from cardiac arrest. And they, I think, have done a good job with figuring out how they can teach this and crystallize this for the call takers, but then also for the public around, well, if you call, let's say in Singapore, it's 995, here's what's going to happen. So they get taught CPR, but they get taught also to be good receivers of the coaching that this telecommunicator is going to provide them. And anyone who has listened to a reasonable number of these calls realizes that a lot of times the challenge is just making the diagnosis. And if the call taker makes the diagnosis and says, hey, you need to start CPR, the person says, oh, okay, fine, I'll go and do that. I didn't think he was in, they don't say this, but they're like, oh, right, he's in cardiac arrest. I got to use my CPR skills. And so they get that permission from the telecommunicator that really drives change. Last week in Singapore was a meeting to begin to focus on how are we going to improve cardiac arrest survival, not in countries other than ones like Australia or the United States that are very resource rich. And how can we help those other communities do a better job too? Now, some of this, if you ask me, is going to be a real challenge because they may not even have an ambulance. So I'm not sure in some communities that it's possible, but other ones I do feel like there is a real possibility. And I had the opportunity to meet with Dr. Rao, who is one of the principals running a small ambulance service in India, where they're very challenged, but they're really doing the best they can. And his organization staffs only 9,000 ambulances, serving a population approximately 1,000 times bigger than Seattle, at 750 million. It just blows my mind how many lives that they're trying to impact. But they do CPR training, and these two people on an ambulance, and one's the driver, okay, and the other's the paramedic, and that's what you get. And those two people are going to do that cardiac arrest resuscitation, and that's all that's coming. So I have an AED, and I'm sure they're going to save some lives, and it's a great place to start. And they're focusing on how they're doing their training and how they can make that better and what they can do, and it's really pretty impressive. 9,000 ambulances, okay? So there you go, Mark. 750 million. Here, you know about this already. Registries operating throughout the region. Very impressive work. Another thing that's come out of here has been sort of the idea that you need to be exposed to more either training or more actual cardiac arrest events. And I think there's some real opportunities within these various services in Australia to get more knowledge about how to do this better, how much training really needs to happen in order to really drive improved performance during actual resuscitations. And that's one of the things that we're working on in Seattle as part of the Resuscitation Academy Foundation. Can we provide better tools that can help those training sessions be more effective? You have a couple of great studies going on here in Australia as well. with the EXACT trial to look at what's the right amount of oxygen to give after you get a return of spontaneous circulation, ROSC. And also, what's the impact for this very tiny group of people that remain in and out of ventricular fibrillation, cardiac arrest. In my system, we're talking approximately maybe 2 or 3 or 4% of the cardiac arrest patients. It's a small number of all of the cases, so it's totally not going to make us move our survival rate from up by 50%, but for those few patients, this matters a lot. And I think all of us are struggling with what do you do with this group, this cohort, and maybe some of them would benefit from getting on ECMO or going to a cath lab and getting their artery open, but it's a very difficult problem to solve, so I applaud those who are working on this. Within the United States, we're continuing to work on spreading our message throughout the U.S. We have an ongoing project that began also about 10 years ago called Heart Rescue that was originally funded by Medtronic Foundation. And they still put some support in, but it's much less than it used to be. But you can see the states colored in orange that are currently participating and a couple other states that will be joining this year into this initiative. All of them have committed to measuring it at the state level what their cardiac arrest survival rate is. And within Washington, we now have 90+% of all the cardiac arrests captured in our state registry. We think that's probably true in Oregon as well. It's definitely true in Arizona. So some of these states have really high levels of compliance now with case ascertainment, which is, within the U.S. system, that's a real challenge because of so many different EMS systems that have to be engaged and get to agree to participate. Just a little video here.
Each day, more than 1,600 people die of cardiac arrest in the U.S. alone, and rates are similar in other high-resource countries. Survival from cardiac arrest varies a lot, from over 50% to less than 3%, depending on where you live. Why? Together, we can do something about it. The Resuscitation Academy has suggested 10 steps that can help communities improve survival. The Cardiac Arrest System Assessment Program has been developed to help EMS services understand how they can improve their cardiac arrest outcomes, one step at a time. The program will build on the leadership of the Resuscitation Academy and will be supported by the American Heart Association and Laerdal. The program starts with an online self-assessment where the basic facts of the EMS system are mapped. For example, the system asks questions about how you train CPR among EMS personnel and how you keep track of their performance. Simply renewing a CPR card every 2 years will give a low score, whereas quarterly training in high-performance team activities with quantitative feedback will give a high score. For all of the assessed steps, the system provides a similar quantitative scoring and mapping. Once you have the initial overview of the EMS system, figuring out how to do something about it may seem overwhelming. To support this process, there is a premium assessment, where a trained assessor facilitates the assessment using available facts and face-to-face interviews with the system's stakeholders. This results in a detailed overview that shows you where you should invest to get the largest return on the investment, both in money and in number of lives saved. Similar assessments should be done regularly to monitor progress and identify if improvements are being made to the system. The periodic assessments will visually show progress over time and provide detailed reports for system decision makers. Participation in the program qualifies your EMS system for recognition by the American Heart Association and the Resuscitation Academy. High-performing EMS systems may be awarded a bronze, silver, or gold Cardiac Arrest Safe Community Award and recognized nationally for their EMS excellence. But most importantly, more people will survive from cardiac arrest.
So we're working on this as a way to help our communities across North America with getting engaged, trying to get some resources from their local governments to focus on the areas where they have the best return on investment. And we hope that this online system assessment will help identify those opportunities and provide some kind of benchmarking. They can see themselves compared to other like communities. Plus, they'll be able to see how they change over time if they repeat the assessment every year, say. So it's a trial. We'll see how this works. We think it will be useful, but we'll let you know in a couple of years what actually happens. So that's kind of a screenshot of what the website looks like. We're also developing, in addition to the team training thing that I mentioned, we're also developing a training program for improving telecommunicator CPR by using standardized patients who are making calls to the call takers when they're not on duty, but maybe at break or at a day when they're not scheduled to work, and they'll practice taking these calls of cardiac arrest. And one of our research collaborators, Hendrika Maischke, just published a randomized trial on this strategy, which suggests that it does improve their performance with relatively brief 15 to 30-minute type training once every 3 months. One of the mantras of our program is to measure and improve. And we really believe strongly that you need to measure what you're doing, and then you can provide data to help drive that improvement. So a couple of things that you can do to sort of help in this within your own communities, and you can make a real difference by getting engaged, and really by helping to snatch life from the jaws of death. I think you will find that you will save more lives in your own communities. So we'd encourage you to follow us on Twitter, to look at the blog periodically, and just to do your part to help raise survival from cardiac arrest throughout Australia and New Zealand. So thank you very much.